Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of our Geostrategy in Action videos series. I'm joined again today by Courtney Rickert McCaffrey, our Global Head of Insights. Courtney, welcome back.
Thanks, Ollie.
So, the timing of today's show is, broadly speaking, 100 days into President Trump's second presidential administration. And we thought we needed to focus on that and to have a discussion, to kind of step back from the news headlines and to have a view about what's happened, how businesses are affected, and maybe a little bit about how businesses can respond as well. So, Courtney, first question for you. So, there's obviously been a lot of headlines recently around April the 2nd and subsequent conversations about tariffs and the US's position on tariffs. But let's not start there. Let's start with the bigger picture. So perhaps can you just give us a flavor of what the first 100 days have looked like? Because it's been a very active 100 days, as President Trump promised. So just give us a little bit of a kind of summary, kind of from this perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, certainly sitting here in Washington, D.C., it has felt like a very active time. So there's been a lot happening. And that's not just sort of a feeling that we have, it's actually borne out in the data. So if you look at executive orders that this second Trump administration has issued, it's more than 130 executive orders in the first 100 days. And that is significantly more than any previous U.S. administration. The first Trump administration actually over the similar first 100 days period only issued 33 executive orders. So that really is, a huge increase in kind of the level of activity, policy change, regulatory change, and sort of exploration of future policy and regulatory change. So, we're not done yet. There will continue to be a lot of volatility and uncertainty going forward. But, really the focus areas of the Trump administration's first 100 days have been around government efficiency, around a variety of different aspects of the America First agenda, whether it's around trade, as you already mentioned, or investments. Obviously, there's been a specific focus on tariffs, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But there's also been a focus on some social issues and a lot of sort of domestic policy changes that maybe aren't getting as much play in the international press.
And Courtney, as you say, a lot of activity, and a huge amount of it was signaled before the election, was signaled between kind of the election and inauguration day. And one of the lessons from that is that President Trump and his team do signal often interest in areas and kind of viewpoints on areas. And I think that's something that kind of we in the business community need to kind of remember that a lot of those things are given a strong signal. Was there anything that has sort of, I guess, surprised you about the first 100 days?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and I think you're absolutely right about the signaling. So I think there's always been this debate the past several years about whether to take President Trump's statements literally or seriously. And I think the answer is both. Yes. So we should definitely be doing that, and we will continue to do that going forward throughout this administration. I think maybe one thing that surprised me initially was the first day in office. There was less of a focus on trade, whereas that had been a lot of the messaging. Obviously, now as we've gotten to the 100-day mark, the focus on trade has reemerged. But that was a bit of a surprise initially. Beyond that, a lot of this was expected. The first Trump administration had a lot of these same policy goals or similar policy goals and policy stances, but it took a little while for things to start moving during the first administration. There were a lot of people in the first Trump administration that were new to government. President Trump himself was new to government. This time around, the team knows what they're doing. They know that the policy levers to pull and how to affect change. And so I think even though it has been sort of a wild ride the past 100 days, it was expected to be this level of sort of change and disruption because that's what President Trump was promising coming into office.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think and people can debate the administration style and so on, but I think the fact that things are and the kind of topics that he and his administration would like to talk about, have been pretty clear for quite a long time, and I think that's a really important point for people to remember. So you mentioned trade, you mentioned tariffs, and we need to talk about that because clearly from April the 2nd onwards, but also a little bit before that as well. Kind of like there's been a really quite dramatic set of announcements on the tariffs front in particular. So, look, I don't think it's worth us kind of repeating everything here because people would have been following it on the news and can access lots of research and lots of updates on sort of what the prevalent tariff rates are and there are negotiations happening, as we speak on some of these things. But maybe what I wanted to ask you to do is just maybe put these current tariffs and the current negotiations into a bigger context, into their kind of historical context, because I think it's a really important point. They didn't come from nowhere, right? We've been talking about how President Trump signals things, but we've also talked a lot, on this series and elsewhere about the fact that tariffs has been a feature of the global landscape for 5, 10 years now, actually. And so maybe just say a few words about sort of that wider context, the kind of the history behind all of these things, so that people can understand that context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that's come out in the last several editions of our annual Geostrategic Outlook, as you well know. The consistent theme has been around policymakers here in the U.S. as well as in many other capitals around the world, really focusing on de-risking their economies, de-risking their supply chains from geopolitical rivals. A focus now on economic sovereignty, economic competition going forward. A large part of which a lot of policymakers see as having more domestic capacity and capability to produce critical products, to really advance their strategic sectors, however those are defined by various politicians around the world. But essentially, what we have seen in the past several years. Um, Certainly since the COVID pandemic and arguably even before, is this increasing focus on de-risking, on sort of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, particularly in those strategic sectors. And again, we've seen, President Trump kind of consistently message what those strategic sectors are for him and for his administration. In his first administration as well, we saw the focus on steel and aluminum. This came back this time, expanding the focus to autos. And now we have, 232 investigations in pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. So again, these things are all messaged, and it is part of a broader story and a broader trend of what we've been watching, policymakers around the world do in the past several years. So although this may be sort of a step change, or certainly a different set of policy tools being used than maybe in previous administrations, the direction of travel has been in place for some time.
Yeah, and I think you make a really important point there. And I think it's fair that people have been surprised perhaps by the scale of some of the tariffs and perhaps by the breadth and the number of countries and the type of countries affected. But I think, it hasn't been a surprise about some of the sectors that he's been thinking about, or some of the kind of the ambitions that he, and the kind of policy ambitions that he's trying to kind of fulfill in doing what he's doing. And I think, I think it's an important kind of point to recognize that underpinning this tariff tool, if I can put it that way, are a number of different policy objectives that the administration has been very, very consistent about. So one of them would be raising revenue. One of them is around the deficits issue. One of them is around sort of national security type goals, and there are others as well. And I think, because we often get the question, and this might be quite a nice segue, is kind of like, what's the end game look like here, and what's the driving forces? And I think it's really hard because there's a series of negotiations happening to know what exactly the end game is. But the best you can do, I think, is to talk to one, that longer historical context of the kind of the steady growth of economic competition throughout the world, the steady rise of populism that you mentioned, kind of throughout the world, but also to have a really crystal clear understanding of President Trump's administration and his policy goals. And I mentioned a couple of them just now, because any outcome, and we don't know the exact outcome, there's too many variables, but any outcome is going to be consistent with those policy goals, and those policy goals themselves have been broadly consistent. And so, we don't have a crystal ball. That's the nature of broad negotiations. But I think, moving a little bit to kind of what we're seeing and how businesses are reacting, I think one of the messages I think you and I would both get across, which is, go back to the fundamentals, go back to the kind of the structural shifts, go back to the clear signals here. Because whilst, as I say, we don't know the outcomes precisely, we know the policy drivers, and we know the kind of historical context for the negotiations that are going to be kind of happening at the moment, or hopefully going to be happening over the next 3 months or so. But on
Mhm.
that, Courtney, I suppose shifting to businesses, what I know you talk to a lot
Mm.
of businesses almost day in day out at the moment. What are you seeing? What are the concerns? How are people responding at this point, given that uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I know you've been obviously speaking with a lot of companies as well. I think the top three themes of all of my recent conversations have really been tariffs, tariffs, and tariffs. That has really been the focus lately. So, there's a variety of actions that companies are considering or have already taken or considering taking or are sort of exploring for the future. So I think there's different sort of time frames in terms of how they're reacting. And there is a bit of that sort of wait and see. As you mentioned, a lot of these negotiations are ongoing. It's a little bit unclear still where the final kind of tariff landscape will land in the coming months. But there is a variety of things that the companies are doing today to try to mitigate some of these impacts. Trying to think about mitigating the impact of duties in a variety of ways, whether that's through product classification or origin. But bigger picture, there has been this sort of supply chain reorientation already happening in recent years. Some of that is getting accelerated. Some of that is certainly kind of the benefits of that are playing out now for companies that were earlier movers in that area. But we're seeing, a few different trends that companies are looking at in terms of supply chain strategy. So one is certainly still around diversification, trying to figure out, where lower tariff markets may be in the future or just how they might want to diversify, not only with kind of the geopolitical and trade policy context in mind, but some other types of strategic questions as well. Some companies looking at sort of localization, whether that's nearshoring or maybe nearshoring, things like that. And then just sort of building that near term resilience because, to this more volatile trade policy environment. So, sometimes that's stockpiling inputs or stockpiling inventory in key markets, trying to make sure that they can sort of weather any near term disruptions that they may face. I don't know if that's similar to what you're hearing and seeing in your client conversations.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar. I reiterate one of the points you made, which is there's almost a kind of there's a short term tactical response, right, which almost everyone has to be looking at and acting on, and then there is a kind of more medium and longer term. What's the strategic response? And I think there are a series of no regrets moves that almost everyone can take to manage the current uncertainty and to kind of improve, in a sense, the resilience of the businesses or the wider organizations in the current environment. And then there's the in some ways the trickier question, which is at what point do I make major, medium, and longer term moves in my supply chain or my investment patterns or my footprint, whatever it might be. And I think people are more comfortable on the former and obviously less comfortable on the latter because they're not quite sure where this will land. But the one extra point I would make would be that I do feel like perhaps more people could be thinking through what they do in the short term, because I think coming back to where we sort of started the conversation, the trends are clear, the wider historical context is clear, and so perhaps there are more things that are clear than we think at the moment, and therefore there are some decisions that you can take with more confidence than perhaps sort of meets the eye when you sort of read the media, read the news, and it's all about uncertainty. Well, that's true. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there is some certainty underpinning in here, underpinning this as well. And that's probably the other message I would draw out from the kind of conversations, which is what can we be confident about, and what do we be consciously not confident about and not sort of make decisions around. And that's a really hard conversation, and it's bespoke for every organization and every kind of question within organization. But I think those are the kind of two questions. So you said that the conversations were tariffs. But there is obviously a lot more going on. Again, circling back to where we started the conversation, and so what kind of other issues are coming up, or what are some of the other conversations that you're seeing the business community concerned about or thinking about?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would say certainly here in the US, either, American companies or foreign companies that have operations in the US, there are some other considerations that come up as well, particularly around sort of R&D policies, central bank independence, and immigration policy as well. So, you know, I have heard a lot of concern about sort of the US role in sort of investment in R&D and innovation going forward. This is particularly, I think, coming out of the life sciences sector, some of those executives that I've spoken with recently. But, as I'm sure you know, there's been kind of a longstanding tradition and history of US government funding for a variety of research, whether that's conducted at government institutions or universities or at private sector companies. And that's been a huge source of innovation in the US economy and sort of a competitive advantage in a lot of ways for many decades. And so some of the executives I've spoken with recently are worried about that competitive edge kind of being eroded by some of these policies. So I'm sure that they are expressing those concerns to policymakers as well and trying to figure out how to maintain that competitive edge and innovation advantage. But that's one of the concerns I'm hearing. And then in terms of the labor market, some of the recent labor market figures have been pretty strong. It's pretty robust labor market still here. So going forward, if immigration flows, decline significantly, or if the labor force is restricted in other ways, that's something executives are watching as well, because that obviously affects, their ability to attract and retain talent, wage levels, and then inflation as well.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I on average at least tend to speak to more kind of European headquartered businesses and also to a degree Asia Pac, and some of those issues 100% come up. I think sustainability comes up quite a lot in the conversations. What does not just the new Trump administration's policy mean, but what do some of the moves by the European Commission mean? Some of the moves by the Chinese government in this space mean, and I think there are some quite sort of mixed signals there. I think in some cases governments are very much sort of remain doubling down on the sustainability agenda, but in other contexts, they're perhaps moving it back a little bit or reducing some of the regulation on businesses on the sustainability front. And so I think there are lots of questions, and maybe we'll explore that in a different video cast actually about the pluses and the minuses for the sustainability agenda coming from the kind of wider geopolitical thing. But that's definitely a topic that comes up. And then I think what I would also add is that, and maybe there's a geographic aspect to this, but obviously the situation in Ukraine still is front of mind for many people. The tensions in the South China Sea as well often kind of come up as well. So what we called in our outlook the kind of geostrategic rivalries and the geopolitical rivalries. I think it also front of mind for people, and I think rightly so. And I think obviously the tariff piece and this video cast is a good example. It's very much front of mind for lots of people, but there are many other geopolitical issues that are kind of alive at the moment, and people do need to kind of follow. I think it's really important that people have a really broad-based view of what's going on at the moment and don't get too narrow-minded on one single issue, however material and however important that issue is. Um, Courtney, maybe one quick question to end with. We've spoken before about our Geostrategy in Practice publication about how businesses respond. And any tidbits from that about boards or something you want to kind of share on this video cast about kind of interesting data about particularly maybe the board piece?
Yeah, well, actually, before getting into the board piece, I think I want to pick up on something you were just saying around, making sure you're not getting too focused on any one issue. That's definitely something we're seeing. Although, yeah, all the conversations lately have at least started on the tariff topic. It often gets broadened because executives want to know what else they're missing, or maybe they should be watching that they aren't. And so I think that definitely aligns with some of the findings from our Geostrategy and Practice study, where we found that a lot of companies, particularly kind of leaders in geostrategy and putting all of this into practice, really have been investing more in kind of their scanning capabilities, their company's ability to identify and monitor risks, and they're planning to invest even more in the coming years, which is probably not surprising, just given how much sort of unexpected change or volatility there has been in so many different policy landscapes. And then at the board level, yeah, I mean, we've seen a significant increase in kind of the activity that company boards are putting into, geostrategic risk management, whether that's around getting briefings on the topics, or, having a board committee dedicated to kind of governing that issue and working with management on geostrategy. But there's still kind of a lack of attention to the issue in terms of how frequently it gets addressed at board meetings. So that's something where that's sort of our call to action for boards, I guess, is to not only have governance around this, but actually do it on a more regular basis. Because as we know, the political risk and geopolitical environment is changing, certainly week by week, maybe even day by day in some cases. And so talking about these things on an annual basis or something like that just isn't enough in the current environment.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So look, this has become quite a long episode, so we should draw it to a conclusion. But and so Courtney, thank you. And I think just to kind of wrap up, and I think some really important issues we've covered today. I think the first thing is that there is a really important wider kind of global context for the actions of the presidential administration. And that for those people trying to navigate kind of what happens next, it's really important to understand what those structural trends are. I think they will give you some kind of tram lines for what might happen next globally. And also that President Trump's administration has been pretty clear about some of its policy objectives. And so, again, they give us some tram lines for how the negotiations will proceed and where this might land. So no one can, as we've discussed, no one can predict exactly where negotiations are going to end up and how different events affect where those negotiations go. But we can put some tram lines behind it. And I think for those that are trying to kind of scan the outside world, to the point you just made, Courtney, I think I really sort of encourage people to think about what those kind of tram lines are and what we do know, despite the kind of high levels of uncertainty that we're all facing at the moment. So I think we'll end there. Hopefully you've found that a kind of an interesting and maybe slightly different approach to looking at the first 100 days of President Trump's new presidency. And yeah, please do share any comments with us. And we look forward to seeing you next time when we're going to dive into maybe the sustainability issue that we touched on briefly. We're definitely going to talk about the role of boards in creating geostrategy as well. So do watch the page and look out for our next episode as well. Courtney, thank you again, and thanks everybody for being with us today. Bye bye.